In the 2023 Rugby World Cup, everyone and anyone who understands the scrum was watching the Springboks v France game. The Springboks had been building up a reputation for quite some time as the scrum giants of rugby and were also favoured to win the game. Meanwhile, France also had an undeniable scrum reputation for picking some of the biggest, strongest props in the game. And quickly watching this game, it seems clear that it was a battle between strength and technique on both sides. But let's get more into that. In the first half, the most noticeable thing is the battling between Uni Antonio and Stephen Kitchoff for ground and positioning. Both Kitchoff and Uni Antonio don't want to give even an inch to each other. They collapsed a couple times in those first few scrums simply for inches of footwork. But what's more interesting is what happened when they didn't collapse. And what we see is Kitchoff being clearly overpowered by Uni Antonio consistently. But we also see Kitchoff being put into very dangerous posture. So let's look a little bit further. Stephen Kitchoff is very clearly keeping close to Uni Antonio on the setup. This is not unintentional. This is very intentional. He is doing what's called closing the gap, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's called closing the gap because it involves closing the gap prematurely between him and the tight head, which is in this case Uni Antonio. So why does Kitchoff do this? Well, this is actually done across rugby for one specific reason, and this is that weight manipulation is harder with less of a gap. This means that when you want to put your weight onto your opponent as a heavy prop, the more of a gap there is, the better you can lean your weight onto them and not have to hold your weight yourself. And so if a smaller prop doesn't want to be weighed down by a much bigger prop, they can close the gap between each other, as Kitchoff is doing here, so that the tight head has to hold his own weight. We can see he has his head almost completely under Uni Antonio's shoulder blade in the bind. So he's obviously sitting close, but that doesn't answer why he is getting crunched. If we look a little bit further, it's actually pretty obvious. His glutes are set much higher than the tight head's glutes. This is a big no-no for loose heads. By having his knees high to keep his glutes high, he is putting weight into his lower back. This isn't unheard of for props, and it is in fact the very thing that makes a prop like Ox Niche great. It's the using of the lower back to deadlift opponents out of the scrum. Clearly, this strategy is valid. However, it has its drawbacks. The big one being it's hard to do. And clearly, against one of the heaviest tight heads in the comp, Kitchoff was fighting an uphill battle and losing. This is even shown by him leading up with his glutes when he's trying to drive up his opponent. The missing link is the strength of the lower back. In the second scrum, there was a lot of Mickey Bicky between the props on the ref's side over positioning. The ref asked them what refs always ask, which is for less pre engagement and for the locks to not push and to hold their weight so that everyone can keep more of a gap. Then, when the scrum did go into fruition, it collapsed, possibly intentionally by the French to hold possession of the ball. Then the famous mark was taken. The following scrum collapsed from the side opposite to our view, so we probably don't know the cause of why it collapsed or how it happened. Now, after a cheeky headbutt tackle from Eben Etzebeth on Uni Antonio, Etzebeth is sent off on a yellow card. So, with a cheeky penalty kick to France, the first half ends with France 3 points ahead. So, next thing you know, it's now the second half. Etzebeth is off in the bin. The Springboks decided to put Peter Steph du Toit in lock, and we are now looking from the other side, seeing the French loosehead Creole Bailey scrummaging against the South African tight head Franz Maherbe. As we all know, a loosehead's big trick in the scrum is positioning themselves under the tight head and lifting them up. Yet, why don't we see that playing out here? Well, that's because body height for those with a typical lower back is determined by the height of the glutes, not the shoulders. And as we can see, although the glutes get low enough that Bailey can get under the tight head's shoulder, tight head is still lower than the loose head by height of glutes. And therefore, when Creole Bailey attempts to lift him up, he doesn't move upwards because he has his body height set lower. This for France isn't helped by one of the locks overshooting on set and going long and then having to retract his foot forward and ruining his positioning. One knee forward, one knee back is never optimal for strength, and he is in that position. Then Peter Steph du Toit loses his feet, and Creole Bailey wheels the scrum around from his side, just as the ball's going out to South Africa. This definitely wasn't the optimal scrum for either team. But France did get a win in ruining South Africa's optimal setup for the back. Now, before we continue, can we just admire the beautiful technique of Sia Khaleesi, keeping his knees all the way on the ground in the eccentric of the movement to ensure a low body height in the scrum? Like, it's just outstanding. And a prop that is low enough to make it all work, it's just beautiful. Throughout this game, often the locks and loose forwards seem to be in opposition with each other's posture, with the majority of the French players keeping their glutes above their shoulders and driving downward into the rest of the forward pack, and the Springbok players keeping their glutes low and under their shoulders and driving slightly upward. This really seems to be the antithesis of the different philosophies in the scrum of each team, with the Springboks focusing more on technique and positioning, and the French focusing on and idolizing brute strength. This is even shown through the type of props they pick and the types of forwards they pick to play nationally. Now, that scrum led to some open play, some kicking, and eventually a line out. And after some more open play, kicking, and ball carrying, one bad pass from the French led to a knock on, and now it's South Africa's scrum. Next scrum, South Africa's ball leaves as usual. The scrum didn't move due to the same concept as mentioned before, with the French loose head not getting his knees low enough to get under the tight head to lift him up. Now, every professional prop is strong, but especially in France, as they pick some of the heaviest props in the comp, and so the scrum can still move from the loose head side, even without lifting the tight head. But in situations like this, without any issue from the locks or loose forwards and strong South African props, there just simply isn't an opening for either team to let up. Now, fast forward a bit, after some open play and a scrappy line out, South Africa knock on the ball and it's France's scrum. With it being the third scrum of the second half, Etzebeth is still in the bin, and this time South Africa doesn't have an 8. It's 7 on 8, with France having one more forward than South Africa. It's France's ball and the scrum goes off without a hitch. France doesn't keep the ball in to farm a penalty and instead kicks it out to farm open play. Now, after some open play which led to a line out, Etzebeth is back on and France has subbed their loose head, and after the French knocked it on in the ruck, it's time for South Africa's scrum in their half. Oh, and now look at that. The bomb squad have entered. A partial bomb squad, of course, as they save Vincent Koch for later. Despite the newly subbed on French loosehead trying his best to reset the scrum and fighting for positioning against a newly subbed scrum, as the name suggests, the bomb squad made quite an impact in the scrum. Ox started by closing the gap and staying low to forcing Uni Antonio to bend over simply to enter the scrum. Also making him have to hold his own weight by going close. With Ox niche right under Uni Antonio's shoulder, he lifted him off balance and sent one of his shoulder blades much higher than the other one. And Bongi Manapi played right into this by dipping his left shoulder down to force Uni to come in almost fully sideways into the scrum. Now, with this being on the side of being illegal, why would the South Africans do it? With the Springboks deep in their own half and not holding possession, they are willing to give away an advantage call to France on the off chance of winning the ball back. But in any case, this led to Uni Antonio being driven back, leaving a space for the loose head coming in sideways to collapse the scrum inward, and so the scrum collapsed and France did get that advantage call. After some open play and a newly subbed on French tight head, France were looking at a scrum in their own half. Now it appears that the new French tight head fell victim to Ox's brutal lifting ability, and the French loose head went in sideways, and the tight head seemed to just drive right past him. But that's not the full story. We must ask ourselves, in a straight-on pushing contest, why would anyone come in sideways, as that can't help moving the scrum forward or back? Well, the truth is it often can, and can also be used for leverage. By taking a player off centre, they can be driven back more easily, as they're not driving straight on and the forces don't go straight at the opponent they're facing. And the same applies for the rest of the scrum. But however, by coming in sideways, it means that if the loose head doesn't get a decent shove on the tight head, they can and will essentially be walked past by the tight head, and often can be chicken winged off the scrum by the tight head, where they pull them sideways so they're not even driving against the scrum. They're essentially separated from the scrum. And that's almost exactly what happened. And in any case, the French tight head and hooker popped their heads up, giving away a penalty to South Africa. Now, nothing significant came from the preceding scrum to the French. The difference in the forwards' posture was shown, but nothing of note. The 8 picked within a couple seconds and the scrum ended. Now, after a French knock-on, it's time for another scrum, and now Franz Maherbe is coming off for Vincent Koch. Remember what we said about boring in sideways? Well, it turns out sometimes the tight head does it back, and this led pretty promptly to the Springboks being driven sideways and slightly backwards, and then collapsing. However, South Africa still got the ball out and got a penalty advantage with it. The next scrum, deep in the French half, both front rows have been completely substituted and it's South Africa's ball. The French loosehead looks at first glance like he has the ideal conditions to overpower Vincent Koch, and yet he doesn't. Why is that? If we look, it looks like he has gotten under him with his glutes positioned below the tight head's glutes, yet he isn't succeeding at lifting him up. If we zoom in, we can see that his knees are low, which is why his glutes are low. Yet, however, his knees have been pushed way far back and his legs almost seem fully extended. This is one of the potential downsides of closing the gap as a loose head. It means if you overshoot, you can put yourself in positions where if you lower your shoulders or your knees, the whole scrum falls on you. It can mean that you put your posture unevenly and you have to hold things unnaturally. Eventually, the pressure breaks and France goes backwards and the ball is thrown out. Now, as for the last scrum of the game, which occurred deep in the French half, after one reset caused by pre-driving and a second reset caused by a collapse from the loose head, tight head dispute over positioning. Once the scrum did go into fruition, nothing significant occurred in the scrum that hasn't been mentioned other than the entire forward packs going long, leading to less drive. That was the only significant detail that occurred in that last scrum. Besides from that, it was completely unimpactful, uneventful. To summarise the scrums, the French players seem to rely on brute strength and power in their scrums. The main posturing that the forwards use is downward angling. They seem to rely on a brute force of shove to move their scrum the most. And on the contrary, the South Africans seem to rely on getting low and deep in the scrum and using an advanced technique and understanding of body height to get under their opponents and to push low with good technique. And when it comes to the props, the French props seem to rely more on strength. When they use angling to take their players off balance, they seem to prefer to bore inward as their focus rather than getting under players. Whether that's due to them being opposed to getting under players or just simply due to the fact that they have heavier props, which makes it harder, it's hard to say. And as for the South African props, they love to get under their players or on top of their players, depending on the tight head or loose head. However, when they do get under their players, as opposed to what most props do, where they use their glutes to get lower than them and they lift them up with a squatting motion, they seem to put all the weight on their lower back and use a deadlifting motion to lift their players up. Additionally, we saw how every scrum is contextual and uses different techniques and strategies depending on the context of the position of the scrum on the pitch and in the game. Meaning, every scrum, depending on where it's taking place and why it's taking place, must be played differently, and both teams use this. Whether it's their ball, whose half it's in, and what part of the game it's in, how it relates to the play, these all affect the techniques that they decide to use in the scrums, and this was massively made clear.